Before we start, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time in your city right now. Keep that time in your head. In this story, a single stamped minute on a telegraph strip decides whether a town shipped honest grain or sold the same bushels twice. The Great Plains between 1907 and 1911 ran on 3 harvest clocks: the weather, the railroad, and the elevator scale. In our town, the elevator was a timber crib 30 feet wide with a cup-and-belt leg that rattled like chain in a bucket when the spout opened. The office had a roll-top desk, a safe, and a wall nail where incoming wires hung to dry. The man behind the desk was Martin Barlow. He bought grain from farmers, paid by grade and weight, issued a negotiable warehouse receipt, stored the bushels in bins, and shipped when the price on the wire said ship. He spoke in bushels and minutes, not in stories. A warehouse receipt here was not a courtesy slip. It was collateral with a serial. One sheet named the elevator, the depositor, the bin, the grade, the net weight, and the serial number. Across the face it said, "Negotiable, deliverable to bearer on demand." Farmers used that paper to draw seed loans. Brokers accepted it for drafts against future shipment. Banks treated clean serials like small, tame bonds. The books kept everything honest, bound receipt pads with numbered stubs that stayed in the elevator, scale tickets copied to the office, switch lists from the yard, and waybills that followed each car out of town. The break in Barlow's business started innocently and visibly. The crop came heavy. The railroad came light. 2 bridges west were under repair, empties trickled, and by the second week of rush the elevator's north and west bins were at capacity. The siding backed up with loaded cars waiting for a crew. Farmers on wagons kept arriving anyway because a field cannot hold ripe grain. Barlow took the only step that made a crowded yard go quiet. He said he would paper the deliveries at today's price and take the grain into temporary cribbing behind the elevator or into bins as soon as room appeared. He issued receipts on deposit for bushels that had not climbed the leg yet, marking the stub store on arrival. No one liked that practice, but everyone understood it for a day or two when the yard boss swore empties would be under the spout by morning. Morning did not fix the yard. For 5 days the railroad fed 1 empty for every 3 Barlow needed. The cribbing behind the house swelled. The men on the platform shoveled fines into barrels because the leg coughed dust like a mill. Farmers wanted money. Brokers wanted cars. The bank wanted collateral. Barlow needed more paper. His printer, a cautious man named Clive Jansen, had set the elevator's receipt form 2 years earlier. Simple border, black letterhead, serial line handset at the bottom right. The official bound pads lived in Barlow's desk, 3 receipts to a leaf with a carbon stub left in the book. On a Tuesday night, Barlow walked into Jansen's shop after closing and asked for a quick continuation of the series, same stock and cut, to keep pace with depositors. Jansen printed 2 new pads beginning at the next serial, and at Barlow's request set a small tray with the digits for the serial line so the last 3 numbers could be hand-changed between pulls. When the forme came off the press and cooled, the new pads slid into Barlow's satchel along with a strip of fresh carbons Jansen had trimmed to match the stub paper. Cash changed hands. Nothing in the street looked wrong. The first duplicate receipt was born as a shortcut, not as a plan. At 10:22 the next morning, Ruth Langan, the depot operator, copied a Kansas City price wire that made Barlow lift his eyes. Number 2 hard weaker, buyers calling, 2 car lots acceptable. Ruth stamped the minute and clipped the strip to a spike on the desk. Barlow crossed the depot, read the figure, and told her to wire a broker named Krell. Can assemble 2 cars this week, receipt security to follow. He could not assemble them that fast, but receipt security would buy him days. Back in the office, he wrote a receipt for a farmer's load, 3,800 bushels, against North Bin 2, and handed it across the counter. Then he pulled a sheet from the new pad, wrote the same serial and the same bushels against the same bin, and slipped it into an envelope addressed to Krell's office as security for the forward sale. The carbon stub in the elevator book matched the number on both sheets. The book did not care that 2 bearers would believe they owned the same grain. The weigher was a careful Polish immigrant named Thomas Zajac. He ran the beam like a church organist. Steady hands, nothing fancy, everything recorded. He logged tare, gross, and net on pre-printed tickets, and each afternoon he set 10 tickets on the desk for Barlow to pair with waybills. When harvest ran straight, Zajac's numbers and the railroad's numbers matched within 100 pounds. When harvest ran crooked, Zajac's tickets still looked neat. The beam doesn't know what a man writes on a receipt. A traveling scale inspector named Orrin Pike came through that week with a sealed weight box and a habit of asking for papers no one volunteered. Pike re-zeroed the beam, checked the counterweights, and wrote a compliance certificate for the office wall. He also asked for the last 10 loaded car tickets and copied gross and tare into his notebook. He had a private column he called Last 3 Tears for Class. Chalk tears drift, but not by 500 pounds in a day. Pike underlined 2 figures and did not say why. The bank cashier, Nora Bell, had a mind that noticed small consistencies before large ones. In the collateral ledger, she wrote each pledged receipt with its serial, name, bushels, and a tiny margin note for the ink tone and impression depth she saw on the paper. It was her personal trick to catch a new forgery or a bad pen. Wednesday, a farmer named Eli Hatcher pledged receipt 35614 for 3,800 bushels at 58 pounds per bushel. Nora wrote her note on the margin, stamped the pledge, and placed the paper in the vault. Friday, a messenger from Krell's office stepped off the noon train with an envelope for verification. Inside sat a receipt for 3,800 bushels, reading 35614. The ink was browner, the impression of the last digit sat a hair deeper. Nora didn't shout. She copied the serial on a narrow strip and clipped it to a page in her ledger where she would see it the next time Barlow asked for an overdraft. Ruth saw the first physical tell 3 days later when a car came back for topping too fast. The morning switch list sent AT&SF 1196731 out of the yard at 10:10 as loaded. At 11:05, the same car rolled under the spout again, this time without a seal. The conductor chalked L small near the sill, as if it had been light the first pass. Ruth stamped the minute on a blank and wrote the car number because the wire to the junction had already reported the car passed their board at 10:22. Cars do not fold track. Barlow stretched time wherever paper allowed. He kept a chalkboard with 4 columns: bin, car, buyer, due. If the buyer column glowed red on the wire and the yard had no empties, he pushed an empty under the spout, ran the leg just long enough to fog the air, dribbled a few 100 pounds through the throat so a scale ticket could pass the laugh test, and pulled the car to the house track with load in transit written on the waybill. No seal needed until final topping. That let him send a receipt to a broker and a pledge to a bank backed by motion, not by grain. When the car came back for the real load, Kincaid the sealman crimped fresh cereals, and his book looked clean because he recorded seals after the last spotting, not before the first. The printer's shop tied everything together in the worst way. Jansen had hand-set the serial line on the new pads. Hand-set serials carry fingerprints in lead, a nick in the face of a 6, a hairline scratch above a 3, a faint tilt on the last digit where the slug was nudged by a thumbnail. Nora did not know printing, but she knew impressions. She set Hatcher's 35614 and Krell's 35614 side by side at closing time and saw the same nick and the same scratch, made darker or lighter by the way ink fell that day. Jansen would see it in a blink. A bank cashier with a lamp saw enough to write a second strip and tuck it into her ledger. People around the elevator noticed little wrong things in different languages. The yard clerk saw chalk teres rewritten over older chalk, not wiped clean. The section crewman saw the same smear of grease on the same coupler pass his post twice in a week. A teenage farmhand scratched a tiny notch on a drawbar for fun and smiled when the notch returned with dust on it, not traveled. Zajac watched the bin gauge mark drop 2 inches on a load that supposedly weighed out 8,000 pounds. Pike tipped bran and a sliver of lead out of the beam housing when he re-zeroed the scale for a surprise test and wrote debris present in his book. None of those details proved fraud alone. Together, they made a pattern most men would treat like a rumor until a number with a badge asked to see the book. What kept the pattern alive for weeks were the town's habits. Conductors wanted clean wheel reports. Yardmasters wanted the house track clear. Sealmen wanted sequence without gaps. Bankers wanted paper they could discount. Farmers wanted a price before a storm. Barlow understood those wants and used them as levers. Every time he wrote a second receipt against the same bushels, he bought himself a day and sold the town a story. The first time anyone pushed back was not at a hearing. It was at Barlow's desk in a quiet hour when everyone who kept minutes in their pockets happened to arrive at once. Ruth brought in a wire from Krell that read margin 2 cents per bushel on forward lots. Remit or convert to site shipment, stamped 1012. Nora set her narrow strip with 35614 beside it and asked Barlow, politely, why she had 2 obligations standing on 1 serial. Pike asked for the last 10 loaded car tickets again and for the stub to 35614 in the bound book. Zajac stood in the doorway and said the bin indicator had not moved enough to match the tickets he had written that morning. Barlow said the stationer had misprinted a pad and they had caught it. Jansen, who had come by to collect for invoice papers, heard the word misprint and stepped into the office without being invited. He said his shop had not misprinted anything. He had delivered a continuation pad as ordered. The room went airless the way small rooms do when polite men stop believing they are in a misunderstanding. Barlow reached for authority he still held. He told Ruth to wire that cars were loading now, and receipts stood. Ruth wrote the message and stamped the minute, because stamping minutes is what she did. She also made a private list on a scrap of cars that had left loaded by her board and returned under the spout the same day. Nora closed her ledger and told Barlow the bank would honor presentments in order of pledge time, not in order of whoever shouted first by wire. Pike closed his weight box and said he would return that night to weigh cars when no one could sweep a scattering of fines under the rail and call it grain. There was one more thing that made Barlow think he could ride the scheme into the next harvest. Every receipt circle in the county preached the same comfort. You can take it to the bank. Banks here did not like to be the first to say a harvestman had lied. County boards did not ask to see elevator stubs unless a sheriff wandered into a conversation. Barlow thought the next crop would refill whatever holes his numbers were chewing. He misjudged a different clock. Price week on the wire meant margin now. Margin meant collateral now. Two holders reached for the same bushels in the same week, and the receipts, seals, and waybills could not tell two good stories at once. Nail. A duplicate receipt is not a delay. It is the same grain sold twice. On paper, a shipped car looks simple. A waybill lists the railroad, car number, origin, destination, commodity, weight, and any remarks. A conductor keeps a wheel report with seal serials. The yard clerk keeps a switch list with where each car sat and when. If those pages agree, a buyer pays without setting foot in your town. Martin Barlow kept those pages looking busy and correct for just long enough to get paid twice. He worked the yard through the people who wrote the small lines. The seal man was Walt Kincaid, a careful man with a canvas pouch, a hand crimper, and a book of serials in neat columns. The yard clerk was Milt Dyer, who liked a clean switch list. The conductor on the local was Hale, who cared about his time more than anyone's theory. The weigher was Thomas Zajac, quiet and exact, who wrote tare, gross, and net the same way every day. The agent was Ruth Langan, who stamped minutes and wire copies and on her own blank slips. The inspector was Orrin Pike, who carried a sealed weight box and no patience for stories that drifted 500 pounds. Barlow's first trick relied on a loophole in the routine. A car under the spout without seals can be described as loading in transit. That remark looks harmless on a waybill. He used it like a key. He spotted an empty under the leg, ran the machinery long enough to throw fines and scent the air, dribbled a few 100 pounds into the throat, and rolled the car to the scale. Zajac wrote a gross that could pass as a partial load. Dyer chalked L small near the sill to tell the next crew to top it off. The waybill carried no seal serials yet, just the phrase load in transit. The car went to the house track, sat where it did not block anyone, and then came back under the spout when Barlow needed to show motion to satisfy a wire. If the buyer looked only at documents, the car was moving. If a person stood on the deck and opened the gate, almost nothing fell. The second trick was the loop. 3 miles down the line, a sugar-beet spur branched off with a gate the yard kept padlocked. At night, with a brakeman's key and an excuse about congestion, a crew could pull a car in, set handbrakes, and let it sit while the clock turned minutes into cover. By morning, the same car could be back under the spout, as if it had returned for topping. When Kincaid finally crimped seals, his book showed a clean sequence because he recorded at the last spotting. The conductor's wheel report looked clean because the seals he saw matched what Kincaid had written. The loop hid inside timing. Only the junction agent's book could make it visible. A car reported past the junction at 10:22 cannot be back at the elevator at 11:05 without a fold in the rail. Ruth kept those junction times like a second ledger. When a buyer's office in Kansas City switched a draft from margin to sight, they notified the junction to expect sealed cars. Ruth wired for the midnight sheet listing sealed loads. The junction clerk copied car initials, numbers, and seal serials, signed his name, and sent it back. Ruth stamped the minute on arrival and laid the sheet next to Dyer's switch list and Kincaid's seal book. On a good day, the 3 columns nested like fingers. On a bad day, transposed digits showed up, a 6 stamped as a 9 in poor light. That single typo broke the spell because it proved a new seal had been applied later, not at the first pass. Kincaid circled the run and wrote issued post-top in the margin of his own book. Once a seal man starts annotating, a scheme begins to lose the room. Zajac's scale did not know about loops. It only knew gravity. Pike taught the room to look for what gravity could not excuse. He kept a column for the last 3 tare weights on a given class of cars. When tares wandered 200 here and 500 there on consecutive days without any shop visit or weather to explain it, he asked to re-zero the beam with his sealed box. One afternoon he lifted the cover, cut the paper strip, set the standard weights, and found the knife edge sitting on a felt of bran and oil. He swept the housing, left the sweepings in a pan, re-zeroed, and watched the next gross fall hundreds of pounds lighter than the ticket. He wrote debris present and fines in housing, showed the pan to Zajac, and told him to leave it on the desk. When a number can be doubted, a pan of debris cannot. Barlow leaned on pace. He kept a chalkboard in the office with 4 columns: bin, car, buyer, due. In the buyer column he wrote names as soon as a wire turned polite into urgent. He used that column to pull cars back from the main on a pretext, claiming grade mismatch, and to push empties under the spout to fake activity. He never let the board look still. He knew what the town wanted to see: movement. Movement kept farmers hopeful, bankers tolerant, and buyers quiet for another hour. He counted on how each person's incentive conflicted with stopping him. Hale wanted to meet his schedule. Dyer wanted a tidy page. Kincaid wanted a seal sequence without gaps. Zajac wanted a beam that did not fight him. Ruth wanted to stamp and move on. If no one compared their pages with the person next door, Barlow could write 2 obligations against 1 serial for weeks. It took frictions piling up across jobs to turn suspicion into pattern. The first friction came from a farm kid with a pocket knife and a sense of mischief. While a hopper sat under the spout, he scratched a tiny notch on the drawbar. 2 days later, he watched the same notch roll by with the same smear of grease and the same fleck of chipped paint. He told his father. The father told the section foreman. The foreman told Pike. Pike wrote the car number in his book and placed a dot next to it, a private mark he used when a story might be repeatable. The second friction came from Dyer's boredom. He disliked seeing chalk rewritten over older chalk. On a morning when a car returned for topping too fast, he wrote, remarked at scale, who did this on the switch list, and initialed it. That note forced a conversation in daylight because the next clerk had to initial under his question. Once a list holds a question with initials, a supervisor cannot pretend no one asked. The third friction came from Ruth's insistence on minute stamps. When Krell's office wired, "Convert to site shipment," she stamped 1012. When Barlow claimed cars were moving, she stamped the outgoing message and kept a private list of return sightings under the spout with minutes. When the junction sheet arrived, listing 3 sealed cars and carried a time earlier than their return sightings, she stamped that too. She did not accuse anyone. She put 2 minutes on one board where they could not live together without inventing a physics problem. Nora made finance walk into the yard. She saw car numbers attached to drafts and wrote them in the margin of her collateral ledger. When a draft from Kansas City cited AT&SF 196731 and a local miller strutted in asking for a short note against that same number because the car was practically in town, she clipped a metal flag to the page. She told the teller across the street to call before honoring any elevator paper with a car number in the memo line. Clerks in towns like this talk before they write. Those calls slowed Barlow by hours, and hours are expensive when a margin clock is running. Barlow tried to clean his trail the easy ways first. He asked Jansen for a reprint of Waybill carbons because, he said, carbon paper had smudged. Jansen refused, Printers in small places do not fake railroad forms. He told Zajac to sweep the beam house. Zajac swept and left the pan in the open because Pike had asked him to. He told Kincaid to start a new seal strip because the old one was out of sequence. Kincaid wrote first and last numbers of the new strip in his book and underlined them. He told Dyer to stop writing notes on the switch list. Dyer wrote one more, larger, and signed his full name. When a buyer's runner came off the train with a draft to be cashed against warehouse receipts and waybills, Barlow leaned on his last defense, showed just enough truth to discourage deeper checking. He opened the office book to the carbon stub for the serial the runner named. The stub matched weight and grade, neat as a hymn line. He handed over a copy of a scale ticket for a car that had weighed that week. The runner saw numbers that met his checklist and nodded. What the runner did not see was that the same serial was pledged at the bank, and the car on the ticket had been in a loop. The runner's checklist did not include Ruth's minute stamps. Pike set a midnight test because spectacle is noise and measurement is quiet. He notified the crew early so no one could claim surprise. At 11:57, he brought out his sealed weight box in front of everyone. At 12:01, Ruth stamped a blank with the first car number as Hale rolled it onto the deck. The tear on chalk differed from the beam by enough to erase the idea that chalk was a substitute for measurement. On the next car, Kincaid read 3 seal serials from his book. Hale read the same numbers off the metal, and Pike cut the wire and opened the gate. Fines fell and stopped. The scale read a trivial change. The waybill had claimed loaded. The junction had listed sealed at pass. The house track had returned the same car for topping in under an hour. Pike read the numbers and nothing else. Ruth stamped each minute. Nora looked at serials in her folder and drew small lines to show who would try to get paid first and who held a paper that would not cover a pawn ticket. While Pike weighed cars, Locke the auditor drew the yard on a legal pad as if it were an adding machine. Far track, house track, spur, junction, scale, office. He wrote each car number that had acted strangely in a column and drew a small circle at the spur for the ones that had left loaded by report and returned under the spout too soon. He did not need to see grain to see the loop. Minutes make maps when men insist on calling lies traffic. By dawn, the pattern could stand on its own without anyone raising a voice. 3 cars had been sealed after their return, not before their departure. 2 tears had been written out of habit and contradicted by the beam. 1 bin had not dropped enough to match what the week's scale tickets claimed. The junction sheet, the seal book, the switch list, and the waybills now argued with each other where the day before they had appeared as a chorus. The office chalkboard still looked busy. The numbers around it had stopped believing. Kincaid did what careful men do when they do not want their names on the wrong page. He stapled the torn portion of his last seal strip to the day's column in his book and wrote used post top in his own words. Dyer made a clean copy of his switch list and kept the original with the questions in his pocket. Ruth filed her list of minutes in a manila envelope and wrote on the tab left loaded, returned same day, with dates. Zajac locked the scale house and left the key on a nail beside the door so Pike could weigh without anyone telling him how. None of that is dramatic. It is how rooms take apart a lie built on paperwork. Barlow still tried to claim street congestion. He said the line had failed him and that he had kept commerce moving the only way a small town could. The conductor shook his head and said the line had been no worse than any other year. The inspector said the line could not turn a sealed car into a bucket of dust. The agent pointed at minutes that did not line up. The seal man pointed at a strip with a gap. The bank cashier pointed at a serial that showed up on 2 promises. Barlow had no new story to tell because every story relied on one fact, that no one would put all 4 pages on one board at once. A loop is not congestion, it is a route back to the scale. Prices do not fall in paragraphs, they fall in cents and minutes. At 9:17 on a Thursday, the depot sounder clicked a run of trades from Kansas City, and the clerk on the other end added one word twice, week. Ruth Langen copied the strip, stamped 9:17, and pinned it. At 9:33, another tick, shaved a cent. At 9:40, number 2, hard slipped 2 more. At 10:05, a broker named Krell wired, margin 2 cents per bushel on forward lots, remit or convert to sight shipment. Ruth stamped the minute and slid the strip into the spike. That language matters. Margin means you owe cash to keep a promise alive. Convert to sight means your paper is no longer good enough. The buyer wants physical cars moving now. Martin Barlow had kept his forward promises alive with negotiable receipts and talk of cars in transit. Now 2 clocks ran at once, the exchange clock and the yard clock. If he could not cover margin and he could not turn paper into sealed hoppers, his whole month's book would be read out loud in the wrong room. At 10:12, Krell's office sent a second wire, not to the elevator, but to the bank. Confirm validity and encumbrance on receipts 35614 and 35627 in hand here from Barlow. Ruth stamped 10:12 on the depot copy and walked it to the bank on a clip. Bank cashier Nora Bell stamped 10:15 received. She did not rubber stamp yes. She wrote records under review, reply pending, and sent it back. She also pulled her collateral ledger and ran a finger down her stripes of serials. 35614 sat there already with Hatcher's name and a violet pledge mark from 2 days before. 35627 sat there with a different borrower. She clipped a thin metal flag to that page and set the ledger where only she and the president could reach it. Barlow tried to buy time with money he did not have. He asked Nora for an overdraft secured by current warehouse collateral. Nora asked one question: list all outstanding receipts by serial and bushels that are not yet pledged elsewhere. Barlow read 3 numbers and paused. Nora opened her ledger to the flagged page and held up Krell's verification wire. The president sent for the branch auditor in the next county by telephone. They did not call the sheriff. They called a man who wrote columns without adjectives. Auditor Emery Locke arrived at 2:06 on the afternoon train, thin as a fence picket, with a leather case and a letter empowering him to take custody of pledged instruments for reconciliation. He set a rule that made the room breathe: we will not accuse, we will match. He asked for 3 things: the bank's collateral ledger, the elevator's receipt book, and any broker confirmations on file. Nora slid the ledger across. Barlow said the receipt book was out for rebinding. The printer, Clive Jansen, heard that from his doorway and said his shop was not rebinding for anyone this week. Barlow walked back across the street and returned with the bound book. Locke drew 4 columns on a sheet: serial, bushels, pledgee, source. Nora read serials from her ledger. He wrote them. He opened broker envelopes, Krell's and 2 others, and copied their serials. He asked Barlow to read all serials still outstanding against on-hand grain. Barlow read the same 3, then, under Nora's look, added 2 more. Locke set a small pencil tick next to any serial that appeared twice. After 12 lines, there were 5 ticks. He did not clear his throat. He asked for scale tickets and bin records that supported those serials. Weyer Thomas Zajac produced a stack of scale tickets: car numbers, dates, gross, tear, net. Locke copied those numbers beside the matching serials and wrote car initials in a narrow column. He asked for the bin chart that showed daily depth by crib. Barlow said his bin chart was kept informally. Zajac fetched a grease-smudged table and a stick marked in feet and inches. Locke did not go up the ladder yet. First, he wanted to see what paper would say when paper had to live with paper. Ruth laid another sheet on the desk. The Junction's midnight list of sealed cars that had passed, copied in the clerk's hand and signed. The list carried 3 car numbers and seal serials. Ruth stamped the minute of its arrival. Sealman Walt Kincaid opened his pouch, turned pages in his book, and read his own sequence aloud. 2 cars matched clean. The third showed a seal serial he had written later in the day. He drew a circle in his book and wrote issued post-top. Ruth underlined the Junction's time. A loop was now a document, not a rumor. Barlow moved to shore up his position the way men do when they think forms can cure facts. He asked Jansen to print a receipt verification notice on cream stock with the elevator letterhead he used for settlements, to mail to the bank and to Krell. Jansen asked if he should match the border cut from the receipt forms. Barlow said yes, too quick. Jansen glanced at Locke's pencil ticks and said he would print nothing until the auditor finished. A printer who had hand-set the serial line on the new pads did not want to find his borders on a third instrument. At 3:11, Ruth's wire clicked again. Krell escalated margin to 4 cents and repeated, "Convert to cite or return, pledged collateral." She stamped the minute and handed the strip to Nora. The president stood in the doorway. The room understood what return pledged collateral really meant. Krell was saying if the bank confirmed duplicates, he would send back the receipts and walk away from the draft. If the bank lied, he would cash and sue. Neither choice kept Main Street happy. Locke needed to know which paper owned what first if everything collapsed. Priority on pledged receipts runs by time of pledge, not by who is louder. Nora paged to Hatcher. 35614 had a bank pledge from Tuesday afternoon. Krell's in hand here arrived Thursday. On a clean ledger, Hatcher stood first. On the ground, 35614 had been used to back a partial shipment to the local mill and to comfort a broker, one serial wearing 3 hats. Locke wrote Hatcher first, broker after, local mill arrangement, satisfied in part. He did not pause to estimate who would scream loudest. He wrote a rule, earliest pledge first. Ruth added control of time to Lockie's control of columns. She compiled a list from her daybook. Cars that left the yard loaded by board times and returned to the spout within 2 hours. She wrote car numbers and minutes in a neat hand and stamped the list at 3:29. The list now lived under bank file light. Barlow's chalkboard at the elevator still glowed with names and arrows, but his arrows did not get to choose what minutes would be printed in a binder. Locke next tested the grain itself. He did not shout, "Open the bins." He asked for the stick and the capacity table and climbed with Zajac and the conductor. Zajac dropped the stick into North 2, called depth, and Locke converted to bushels from the chart. West 1 read short by a margin that could be explained away as shrink only if a man wanted to be lied to. South 3 had been peaked. Air glinted under the slope when the lantern hung low. Locke wrote void beneath peak and moved on. Back on the floor, he set those physical numbers beside pledged bushels by serial. The left column said gravity. The right column said paper. The gap between them was not weather. It was math. He then asked Jansen to unwrap the Form A he had brought at the bank's request. Jansen laid the small chase on the table. The serial line at the bottom right was handset, 3 digits that a compositor swapped between pulls. Locke inked the forme and pressed it into waste stock. Under a glass, the impression showed a nick in the face of the 6 and a hairline scratch over the last digit. Tells that repeat when type repeats. Nora brought Hatcher's 35614 from the vault and Krell's 35614 from the envelope. The nick and the scratch sat in the same places on both. A numbering head would not do that identically. Handset type would. Jansen nodded once. He did not want the next line in any report to read printer complicit, but he would not lie to save a man who had paid cash for extra pads. By 4:30, Locke had 4 piles and a line drawn through each. Duplicate serials ticked on the sheet, waybills for cars that looped, bin depths that missed their claims, and a handset serial tell between receipts. He wrote a short internal memo to the bank president that read, "Elevator has issued non-unique negotiable instruments, shipped or attempted to ship against grain not physically present. Recommend immediate freeze on drafts. Notify all holders to present. Secure bins and receipt books. Receiver to be appointed pending exam." He signed it and handed Nora a separate list. Serials to notify first, by pledge time. Barlow tried to work around a freeze before it went on paper. He took 2 receipts, 35614 and 35627, across the street to the second bank and asked for a small note to cover margin. The teller asked for a day. He also called Nora out of habit because clerks in a 2-bank town keep each other from swallowing bad paper. Nora asked him to read the serials. She told him to hold the receipts, not to return them to Barlow, and to please write the time of presentment on a slip. He wrote 4:52. Barlow walked out with nothing funded and 2 pieces of paper no longer in his pocket. Krell's runner arrived on the 5:40 with a satchel and a letter. The letter threatened suit if fraudulent paper had been issued. Locke did not argue about words. He asked to see what the runner carried. The runner laid 5 receipts on the table. 2 matched Nora's pledges. 1 matched a local mill note. Locke set the glass on each and found the handset tells. He offered the runner a look at the bins with the stick. The runner declined the latter and said cars would do. Ruth set the junction sheet and the money stamps in front of him instead. He did not admit anything. He folded the sheet into his satchel and said the firm would convert its draft to a claim. That sentence meant Krell had decided to fight from a desk, not a siding. By evening, the bank placed a quiet hold on all drafts payable to Barlow. The hold lived as a red pencil mark on an instruction sheet and a word to tellers. Nora wrote letters to holders of receipts in the duplicate list. Present instruments at the bank by noon tomorrow, with identification for verification and instruction. Ruth wired Krell. Auditor examining. Shipments frozen. Reply within 24 hours. Pike arranged his midnight test with Zajac and Kincaid in writing. Dyer copied his switch list and left the original with the questions in his pocket. Jansen took his forme home and locked it in a drawer. The effect hit Main Street before anyone used the word fraud in public. A feed merchant called to cancel an order because the car he was counting on did not exist. A blacksmith refused to advance repairs on wagon boxes because harvest money in the draft was now in review. The mill shut the North Stones and ground feed only. Farmers who had pledged receipts asked whether they could still buy coal and seed against those papers. Nora did not bluff. She said the bank would honor in time order from grain under lock and from any recovery from the broker. She used one phrase 3 times so no one could say she had promised more than arithmetic. Pro rata on recovery. Locke set one more control before the midnight test. He drafted a custody receipt for the elevator's books and remaining blank pads listing quantity and first and last serial numbers, and had Barlow sign. He sealed the roll top with a paper strip and his initials, set 2 section crewmen at the elevator doors, and wrote that no car would sit under the spout without himself, Pike, or Nora standing on the deck. He did not bring a deputy. He brought a pencil and a rule. In towns like this, a rule on a page with a signature can close a gate without a badge. At 8:55, Ruth set 3 blank slips by her stamp, ready to mark minutes as the midnight weighing started. Nora brought a folder of flagged cereals. Pike brought his sealed weight box. Kincaid brought his seal book and a fresh strip with first and last numbers written in the margin. Dyer brought the switch list. Zajac oiled the pivots and left the pan of sweepings on the desk, exactly as Pike had asked. Barlow stood with both hands visible. The scale pointer sat at 0. The depot clock ticked toward 12, say. The wire in the next room carried other towns' prices, falling 1 more cent. This town had enough numbers to stop pretending its cars were full, and its paper was unique. Nail margin calls turn receipt tricks into audits. Duplicate serials do not survive a column and a minute stamp. They kept the circle tight at midnight, so there would be no second version later. Auditor Emery Locke stood with his notebook. Inspector Orrin Pike broke the seal on his weight box in front of everyone and set the beam to 0. Agent Ruth Langan laid out blank slips and inked her date stamp. Sealman Walt Kincaid held his pouch and his log. Weigher Thomas Zajac took the lever. Conductor Hale and yard clerk Milt Dyer brought the cars to the deck and read numbers aloud. Printer Clive Jansen set a wrapped forme on the table. Bank cashier Nora Bell had a folder with flagged serials. Martin Barlow kept both hands visible on the edge of the desk. At 12:01, Ruth stamped the first slip as Hale rolled an empty onto the deck. The chalk tear differed from the beam by 220 pounds. Pike wrote the figure. The next car was listed loaded and sealed on the waybill. Kincaid read 3 seal serials from his book. Hale repeated them off the metal. Pike cut 1 seal, opened the gate, and watched fines fall and stop. Zajac read a trivial change on the index. Ruth stamped 12:13. Locke drew a pencil line from that minute to a broker draft keyed to that car number in Nora's folder. 2 more cars repeated the pattern. 1 gave out nothing. 1 gave a pan of dust. Kincaid's seals matched his book every time, which meant the fraud lived before the final crimp. Pike had Zajac fetch the bin stick and the capacity table. North 2 and West 1 measured short of their claimed bushels. South 3 had been peaked. Under lantern light, you could see air under the skin. Locke wrote void beneath peak and moved the column of physical counts next to pledged paper. Jansen unwrapped his forme at Locke's request. The serial line on the elevator's receipt form was handset metal, 3 digits swapped between pulls. Jansen inked and pressed once into waste stock. Under a glass, the impression showed a nick in the 6 and a hairline scratch over the last digit. Nora laid down 2 originals with the same serial from her vault and from a broker satchel. The nick and scratch sat in the same place on both. A numbering head would not do that identically. Handset type would. Jansen did not dramatize it. He identified his work and said when and how he had been paid for extra pads. Ruth brought in the junction's midnight list copied in longhand by the clerk and signed. 3 cars Barlow had called topped and sealed showed at the junction earlier that night as unsealed at pass. Ruth stamped the arrival minute and slid the sheet next to Kincaid's seal book. Kincaid circled a gap in his sequence and wrote "Issued post-top" in the margin. Dyer put his switch list down with a note he had written in daylight. Remarked at scale, "Who did this?" Pike set his initials to a line that read, "Loop pattern confirmed." No one used adjectives. The paper started to talk by itself. Locke took custody of the elevator's bound receipt book, the duplicate pads, the bin charts, and a set of scale tickets. He wrote a memo to the bank president in one sentence a board could defend. The elevator had issued non-unique negotiable instruments and shipped or attempted to ship against grain not physically present. Therefore, drafts were frozen, holders would be notified to present, bins would be secured, and a receiver should be appointed pending exam. He signed it, handed Nora a list of serials to summon by pledge time, and asked Ruth to wire the broker. Auditor examining, shipments frozen, present receipts, or return them. They did not bring a deputy to the scale house. They posted 2 section men at the elevator doors and sealed the roll top with a paper strip over Barlow's signature and Locke's initials. They did not argue with Barlow about intent. They put names, minutes, weights, seals, and serials on a board in one room. At 10 in the morning they moved to the council chamber because it had a long table and hooks for boards. Locke pinned 4 columns, serials with duplicate ticks, car numbers with seal serials and minutes, bin depths converted to bushels, and price wires with margin times. Pike filed his report with a state seal. Ruth filed her stamped lists. Kincaid stapled his torn seal strip over his day column, first and last numbers underlined. Dyer filed his original switch list with the questions. Jansen signed a typed statement that his shop had printed additional pads after hours, paid in cash, and that the serial line had been handset at the customer's request. Zajac signed the capacity readings and the pan contents. Nora swore her collateral ledger entries and the order in which pledges had been received. Holders came when summoned. Farmers brought receipts folded in waxed cloth and asked whether the paper would still buy coal and seed. A local miller brought a note with a car number written in the margin. Krell's runner brought a satchel with receipts and a letter threatening suit. Locke did not negotiate at the table. He set a principle the bank could stand on later without apology. Earliest pledge first, then pro rata on recovery. He drew lines from serial to holder in time order. Hatcher's 35614 went to the top of the farmer column. Krell's copy of 35614 went to the broker column with returned or inspected written next to it. The miller's partial claim sat on a third line, marked satisfied in part, against prior deliveries. Locke wrote these dispositions in pencil where everyone could see them and asked the clerk to copy them into the bank's notice. The town wanted a name for what had happened. The law does not care about town words. The president of the bank read Locke's memo and called a meeting of directors. They voted to ask the district court to appoint a receiver over the elevator for the protection of creditors and depositors. The judge signed the order the same day. The receiver inventoried bins, office cash, contracts, and fixtures, and posted notices that any use of the leg or spouts required written authorization. Barlow stayed in his house and wrote a short note through his lawyer that used the word congestion twice and mistake 4 times. The word on the charging document would be issuing a false instrument and obtaining money by false pretenses. They did not cuff him at the table. They filed papers and set a date. The bank mailed notices to every serial on the duplicate list with instructions to present in person within 3 days. Nora wrote them in plain language. She did not promise cents on the dollar. She wrote time of pledge, amount likely to be honored from physical grain, and a second distribution after recovery from broker and sale of elevator assets. She kept her phrase pro rata on recovery. She wrote it because it is the only honest promise a bank can make when paper ran ahead of grain. Krell's office stopped talking about margin after the receiver's notice went out. They wrote a letter reserving their rights, sent back 2 receipts by registered post, and converted their draft to a claim. They did not sue that month. They waited to see whether a receiver's sale would make them whole. That is what broker offices do when they would rather get money than a headline. The railroad adopted a change without asking anyone's permission. The superintendent ordered that all seals applied at the elevator be recorded at the moment of application by the agent in the depot, not later by the sealman alone in his book, and that the junction wire a noon and a midnight seal reconciliation list with agent initials. Ruth did not argue. She had been doing that work already. Now the instruction lived in a circular with a line number. Kincaid started reading his sequence aloud at the window as he crimped. The habit was dull and effective. Pike sent his report to the state and attached one recommendation a legislative committee could understand. Require pre-numbered consecutive warehouse receipts using mechanical numbering heads rather than handset serials, with county registration of each series issued to each elevator, and make duplicate series a misdemeanor whether or not fraud is proven. The committee would copy the recommendation almost word for word 6 months later. This is how a midnight test turns into a rule. Zajac kept his job under the receiver and answered more questions than any man with a steady hand ought to answer in public. He showed how he zeroed the beam, why chalk tears were convenience and not law, and what the pan of sweepings had looked like before Pike pointed to it. He did not excuse himself. He said he had trusted chalk when he should have insisted on re-zeroing in front of whoever brought a car back for topping. The receiver sent him to 3 other houses to teach younger weighers to keep a debris pan on the desk and to show it to anyone who asked. Jansen testified in a short hearing and brought his form. The prosecutor asked why he had printed extra pads. He said he had printed what was ordered and paid for, and that he was not the elevator's book. The judge asked one question that mattered. Could the serial line have been printed in a way that made duplication harder? Jansen said yes. He explained numbering heads and pre-numbered stock. The judge wrote that down and underlined it. No one needed to make the printer a villain to fix the hole. Hale and Dyer were not called to the stand because their lists had already been admitted, but the railroad used the mess as a training case. Conductors were told to write seal serials in their wheel reports at the moment applied, and to initial any remarked car at the scale with a reason. Yard clerks were instructed to treat retops as exceptions logged with a minute, not shorthand notes. If a car returned within 2 hours of being reported past the junction as loaded, the agent had to stamp a form called a contradiction and wire the superintendent. Ruth smiled when that form arrived in the mail. She had been writing contradictions on scrap for a month. Now the scrap had a name and a box on a shelf. Farmers did not get all of their money. The first distribution honored the earliest pledges against physical grain under lock. Hatcher stepped out of the bank holding less than the paper said, but enough to buy feed and coal and to carry seed in spring. The second distribution came from the receiver's sale. The elevator building, the leg and cups, the scales, the platform, the office safe, and the contract rights. Barlow's house and personal effects made a third, smaller pool. Pro rata on recovery did not feel like justice at the counter. It felt like arithmetic and air. Nora took the sour looks and did not argue. She gave dates and numbers. Numbers were what the receipts had pretended to be. Main Street tightened its belt. The feed store took deliveries on cash only until fall. The blacksmith hung a sign that said, "Payment on pickup." The mill ran one set of stones for 3 weeks. People did not boycott the railroad or the bank. They went quiet, which is worse for a town than loud for a week. The receiver leased the elevator to a firm 2 counties over under a rule set that read like Pike wrote it. Mechanical serials, daily seal reconciliation, end-of-day bin gauge readings signed by both the weigher and the agent, and a copy posted in the depot window where anyone could read it. Barlow pleaded to a single count to avoid a long trial that would bleed the town more than the case was worth. He admitted issuing non-unique negotiable instruments and making shipments or attempted shipments not supported by physical grain. The sentence carried a fine, a term, and a bar from acting as an officer of any grain house. He left town after the receiver finished the sale. No one gave a speech at the depot. People looked at the ground and at their hands. Locke closed his report with 2 clean sentences. Minutes, seals, weights, and serials must reconcile daily across elevator, depot, and bank, or the town is running on stories. A duplicate receipt is not a delay. It is the same grain sold twice with a date and a witness.